Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us as we continue our study in the book of 1 Samuel. Today we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 20. In previous lessons, we have seen King Saul, Israel's first king, getting more and more unstable. And in chapters 18 and 19, we saw the resoluteness with which Saul sought to bring David to death. Saul sees him as a threat to his throne, and he's willing to do anything, even kill him, in order to get him out of the way. And we saw at the end of chapter 19, where after several attempts on David's life, at least 3 of those at the hand of Saul himself, David finally just flees. He runs to Samuel, and even that's not too far for Saul to continue his chase. Saul continues to go after David, even to different cities in Israel. And that's where we find David now. We find him running for his life. And he must have seemed completely all alone. He was married, but he couldn't go back to his wife. His wife was Saul's daughter. He was in a place where he must have been wondering who he could trust. What human being could he turn to? Well, ironically, we're going to find in 1 Samuel 20 that the answer to that is Saul's own son, Jonathan. 1 Samuel 20 tells us of the deep bond between these two men, and it provides a touching episode of their willingness to bind themselves to one another through a covenant that's deeper than friendship. It resembles more a deep brotherhood than anything. And so let's look together at 1 Samuel chapter 20 as we first consider David's fears. In the first few verses of 1 Samuel 20, it says, "Then David fled from Naioth and Ramah, and came and said to Jonathan, 'What have I done? What is my iniquity, and what is my sin before your father, that he is seeking my life?' And he said to him, 'Far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. So why should my father hide this thing from me? Is this not so?' Yet David vowed again, saying, 'Your father knows well that I found favor in your sight, and he has said, do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved. But truly, as Yahweh lives, and as your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death.' Then Jonathan said to David, 'Whatever you say, I will do for you.'" Now, as we said before, 1 Samuel chapters 18 and 19 chronicles several successive attempts by Saul to kill David. And as I said before, at least 3 of those attempts come at the hand of Saul himself as he flings a spear at David, hoping to pin him to the wall. The king is intent on taking David's life. And so David, his fear is rooted really in confusion. He asks these 3 words, or these 3 questions. What have I done? What is my iniquity? What is my sin? And it seems as though these are sincere questions. David really wants to know, could this possibly be my fault? If it is, perhaps there's maybe something that David could have done to make amends, to repent, to otherwise make it right. And Jonathan just refuses to believe it. He says, "No, my father would let me know. This can't be true." Now, that seems almost ludicrous in spite of, or in light of what Saul had told Jonathan back in 1 Samuel 19. In 1 Samuel 19 and verse 1, it says that Saul told Jonathan that he was going to put David to death. But the last that we hear of between Jonathan and Saul is what's told to us in 1 Samuel 19 verse 6, where Jonathan attempted to soothe the anger of his father. And it says that Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul vowed, "As Yahweh lives, he shall not be put to death." And maybe that was the last that Jonathan had heard of his father's attempts to do in David. Well, at any rate, he refuses to believe it. And yet, David knows that his situation is shaky. He says there in the end of verse 3, in spite of all of this, your father doesn't want you to know because he knows you won't like it. And he says, "There's hardly a step between me and death." David is in a precarious situation. So they come up with a plan to confirm whether or not Saul really wants to kill David is true. In verse 5 it says, "So David said to Jonathan, Behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I ought to sit down to eat with the king. But let me go, that I may hide myself in the field until the third evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem, his city, because it is the yearly sacrifice there for the whole family. If he says, it is good, your servant will be safe. But if he is very angry, know that he has decided on evil. Therefore, deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of Yahweh with you. But if there is iniquity in me, put me to death yourself, for why then should you bring me to your father? Jonathan said, Far be it from you. For if I should indeed learn that evil has been decided by my father to come upon you, then why would I not tell you about it? Then David said to Jonathan, Who will tell me if your father answers you harshly? Jonathan said to David, Come, let's go out into the field. So both of them went out to the field. And we'll stop there. David says the next day is this new moon festival, which according to Mosaic law was celebrated with the offering of sacrifices and the blowing of trumpets. David's absence at Saul's court would have been noticed. And so David's excuse that he comes up with in verse 6 would have been understandable, at least by a reasonable man. And if it's accepted by Saul, it may indicate that the king has calmed down. Maybe he would be enjoying one of his fewer and more far between saner moments. But if Saul erupted, then it would not only confirm David's suspicions, it might indicate that Saul's suspicions about David had increased, and that he maybe was thinking that David was rousing support against him or something to try to usurp the throne. Whatever it was, it would have meant that Saul would have missed another opportunity to kill David if David would have come in to the feast and had been at Saul's table. But something else I don't want us to miss here is how David is still willing to be held accountable. He says to Jonathan, he says, If there is any iniquity in me, then put me to death yourself. If you really believe that there is something I have done that is irredeemable, he says, then it's better than you should just kill me. Well, that's commendable of David. But of course we know that David hasn't done anything. Saul is overcome by a lunacy that wants to express itself in the killing of David, Israel's next king. And so as they go out into the field, they end up making a bond, a vow, an oath, a covenant with one another. In verse 12, it says, Then Jonathan said to David, Yahweh, the God of Israel, be witness. When I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow, or the third day, behold, if there was good feelings towards David, shall I not then send to you and make it known to you? If it please my father to do you harm, may Yahweh do so to Jonathan and more also, if I do not make it known to you and send you away, that you may go in safety. And may Yahweh be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, will you not show me the loving kindness of Yahweh, that I may not die? You shall not cut off your loving kindness from any of my house forever, not even when Yahweh cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, May Yahweh require it at the hands of David's enemies. Jonathan made David vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. Now you've heard me say over and over and over again, God's name, Yahweh, here. That's because Jonathan refers to it over and over and over again in this text. In fact, it's used at least 10 times in this chapter, and it's used in almost every sentence in this oath that Jonathan brings before David for them to make to one another. He uses it frequently in this covenant setting because it's suitable to use in a covenant setting. Yahweh was God's covenant name to Israel. In fact, that's what we find him saying back in Exodus 20 when he's giving the commandments to Moses. I am Yahweh your God. You shall have no other gods before me, he says. So this covenant that they're taking takes on even greater solemnity and seriousness, because he's invoking the name of God in this covenant. And whenever Israelites made oaths or vows, they were to be considered serious and binding. In fact, go with me for a moment to the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy 23. In Deuteronomy 23, beginning in verse 21, Moses said, "When you make a vow to Yahweh your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for it would be sin in you, and Yahweh your God will surely require it of you. However, if you refrain from vowing, it would not be sin in you. You shall be careful to perform what goes out from your lips, just as you have voluntarily vowed to Yahweh your God what you have promised." Even Moses understood the seriousness of making an oath before God. And we should know that invoking God's name as witness, which Jonathan does here in verse 12, Yahweh, the God of Israel, be witness. It intensified the obligation of the oath. And this oath contains 3 sections. First of all, there's Jonathan's responsibility in verses 12 and 13, where he would take personal responsibility for letting David know and for David's escape from Saul. Then there is David's loving kindness in verses 14 and 15. And here it really seems to be driven home that Jonathan knows that the kingdom is going to go to David. And as Israel's next king, he pleads that David would deal kindly with his house. It was customary in those days, among at least the pagan kingdoms, and we see it sometimes in the Israelite dynasties as well, where a king would eradicate the household of a threat or the previous king, so that there wouldn't be any usurpation of the throne by a relative. And so he is asking here in verse 14 that David would show, he says, the loving kindness of the Lord, the kindness of God. And we see that same phrase come up later on when David does do this, when he shows compassionate care for Jonathan's crippled son Mephibosheth. In 2 Samuel chapter 9, he says, "Does Jonathan have any children that I may yet show God's kindness towards him?" And Mephibosheth is the one to whom David shows kindness too. But also, we see in this covenant that David's success is alluded to. At the end of verse 15, Jonathan mentions that Yahweh will cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. David is going to be successful in what he does, and it's also a reaffirmation that David is going to be a man of war. But finally, I want us to realize that the vow contained more than mere obligation. It was obligation that was based on mutual love. Look again at verse 17. Jonathan made David vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. And it sounds very much like the love that is enjoined in the very law of Moses. In Leviticus 19, verse 18, God said through Moses, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And that's exactly what we find here. Jonathan loved David just as he loved himself, just as he loved his own life, it tells us. And so there is a plan, at least, for David's safety. In verse 18, it says, "Then Jonathan said to him, 'Tomorrow is the new moon, and you will be missed, because your seat will be empty. When you have stayed for 3 days, you shall go down quickly and come to the place where you hid yourself on that eventful day, and you shall remain by the stone Ezel. I will shoot 3 arrows to the side, as though I shot at a target. And behold, I will send a lad, saying, Go find the arrows. If I specifically say to the lad, Behold, the arrows are on this side of you, get them, then come. For there is safety for you and no harm, as Yahweh lives. But if I say to the youth, Behold, the arrows are beyond you, go, for Yahweh has sent you away. As for the agreement of which you and I have spoken, behold, Yahweh is between you and me forever. Now, the signal for David to know the outcome of whether Saul has been calmed down or erupts in anger is an easy one. David's instruction to his arrow-chasing servant would indicate whether David was to come back to Saul's presence or flee for his life. But I want you to see something here. We see an instance of Hebrew faith here in God's providence. He says, if it's for you to come back, he says there's safety for you as Yahweh lives. But if the signal is for you to go, he says, go, for Yahweh has sent you away. Whatever indication it might be, Jonathan says, really, this is going to come from God himself. And it kind of reminds us, I think, at least me, of Joseph's consideration of God's providence. You remember at the very end of the book of Genesis, where Joseph tells his brothers, as for all the stuff that happened, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, to preserve the lives of many alive. Well, Joseph saw the hand of God somehow working behind the scenes, orchestrating all the things that had occurred so that the Israelite family could survive and even thrive. And now Jonathan sees that whether David is to come or go, it will be the Lord's decision. It'll be God's decision. And God is the one who's going to provide the right answer. And so, finally, Jonathan reminds David that God was the one that was overseeing this friendship between them. Yahweh is between you and me forever, he says. Now, this sounds a lot, or at least it's very reminiscent of another kind of covenant that had occurred between two very different men, Jacob and his father-in-law Laban. In fact, go with me back to the book of Genesis 31. In Genesis 31, Jacob had fled from his father-in-law's place with his wives and his children. And of course, Laban still considers his daughters his own, and so he goes out after them. And Jacob is intent on going back to Canaan and setting up his household there. Well, Laban wants to make sure that his daughters are not mistreated, and so they set up a heap of stones. And in verse 48 of Genesis 31, Laban says, "This heap is a witness between you and me this day." Therefore it was named Gilead and Mizpah, for he said, "May Yahweh watch between you and me when we are absent from the other." Now that sounds a lot like what's going on with David and Jonathan, right? Well, let's keep reading. In verse 50, he says, "If you mistreat my daughters, or if you take wives beside my daughters, although no man is with us, see, God is witness between you and me. Behold this heap, and behold the pillar which I have set up between you and me." Here in Genesis chapter 31, the witness of God was meant as a threat if Jacob mistreated Laban's daughters. Back in 1 Samuel chapter 20, God being between Jonathan and David was not a threat. It was a source of comfort to know that God would be watching for the mutual well-being of David and his friend Jonathan. So the same kind of words are used, but in very different contexts and for very different purposes. Well, let's keep reading back in 1 Samuel chapter 20. We see as we come to the dinner at Saul's house, that there is confirmation. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, beginning in verse 24, it says, "So David hid in the field, and when the new moon came, the king sat down to eat food. And the king sat on his seat as usual, the seat by the wall. Then Jonathan rose, and Abner sat down by Saul's side, but David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul did not speak anything that day, for he thought, it's an accident. He's not clean. Surely he's not clean. It came about the next day, the second day of the new moon, that David's place was empty. So Saul said to Jonathan his son, why has the son of Jesse not come to the meal, either yesterday or today? Jonathan then answered Saul, David earnestly asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem. For he said, please let me go, since our family has a sacrifice in the city. But my brother has commanded me to attend, and now, if I have found favor in your sight, please let me get away that I may see my brothers. For this reason he has not come to the king's table." Now, let's just stop there for a minute. David's absence at the table was noticed immediately. And at first, Saul reasoned to himself that maybe David is absent because he has somehow been ceremonially defiled. He says he's unclean. Surely that's the reason. He's unclean. And it could be that perhaps he was thinking maybe David had touched a dead body. David was a man of war, after all, who Saul had conscripted to fight his battles for him. And so maybe he thought, well, maybe that's the reason why he's unclean. We don't know exactly why Saul thought that, but at least for now, he's willing to give David the benefit of the doubt. But the second day comes, and David is still missing. I want you to notice how he refers to David. In verse 27, he says, why has the son of Jesse not come? Saul doesn't refer to David by name, but rather as the son of Jesse, and it's not going to be the last time. We're going to see later on in this chapter where he tells Jonathan that he's choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame. In chapter 22, he calls David, he refers to David as a son of Jesse and asks the Israelites, will he give all of you fields? In chapter 22 and in verse 13, he accuses his son Jonathan and says, why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me? I'm sorry, in chapter 22, he's accusing others, not his son Jonathan, of conspiring against him with David. But you see that this phrase, the son of Jesse, it's obvious that to Saul it was a phrase of contempt. After all, Jesse wasn't a rich man. He was of no account in Israel. But again, we see Saul forgetting his own roots. Saul came up from very humble beginnings to be enthroned as leader of God's people. But yet he looks with contempt at David, the son of Jesse. And so Jonathan offers what he certainly would think would be a reasonable excuse. Look, it's a festival for the family also, and so David wanted to go and be with the family. And so he says that he was actually ordered to do it. In verse 29, now I know it's a lie, but he phrases it in a certain way. In verse 29, he says, this is what David said, my brother has commanded me to attend. So Jonathan is making this all seem as though David was obligated elsewhere. But what happens? Well, look in verse 30. Then Saul's anger burned against Jonathan, and he said to him, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you're choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore now, send and bring him to me, for he must surely die. But Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, why should he be put to death? What has he done? Then Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him down. So Jonathan knew that his father had decided to put David to death. Then Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and did not eat food on the second day of the new moon, for he was grieved over David, because his father had dishonored him. Saul erupts in anger. And it must have been a surprise. It seems at least it's surprising to Jonathan, because it seems as though that's not the reaction that he was expecting from his father. But we're going to find that this confirmed, of course, David's worst fears. And he spews this hateful language from his mouth. Now, Jesus tells us in Matthew 12 and in Matthew chapter 15 that what's in a man's heart will find his way out. And that's exactly what happens here. Saul has nothing but hate and contempt for David. And it's directed at the one who brings him the bad news. He's yelling at the messenger here. He's yelling at his son. I want you to notice this sort of appeal that Saul makes to his son as he rails at him. First, he uses kind of a three-pronged approach. He tries to influence him by using shame, guilt, and greed. First, he says, "You're choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame," in verse 30. And then he tries to guilt him into thinking that this is going to shame your mother. Also in verse 30, he says, not only to your own shame, but to the shame of your mother's nakedness. In other words, this is going to bring shame to your mother if this is what you continue to do. And then finally, he appeals to him on the basis of greed, where he says in verse 31, "For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore now send him and bring him to me, for he must surely die." He tells him, as long as David is living, you're never going to be king. I think David already understood that. Saul was the one who was having a hard time coming to grips with this. And finally, he just absolutely removes any doubts in Jonathan's mind that he wants David dead. In fact, he demands that David be brought to him to die. And this crazed king was even willing to kill his own son in order to satisfy his murderous ravings. There in verse 33 it says that Saul hurled his spear at him. And then it says, so Jonathan knew that his father had decided to put David to death. There's no more wondering, and there's no more giving his father the benefit of whatever doubt that Jonathan might have intended for him. He knows now the murderous urging of his father, and how determined Saul is to finally have David killed. Well, Jonathan has to deliver this news to David, and so he does, and we find them doing so in a very tearful goodbye. In verse 35, it says, "Now it came about in the morning that Jonathan went out into the field for the appointment with David, and a little lad was with him. And he said to his lad, 'Run, find now the arrows which I am about to shoot.' As the lad was running, he shot an arrow past him. When the lad reached the place of the arrow which Jonathan had shot, Jonathan called after the lad and said, 'Is not the arrow beyond you?' And Jonathan called after the lad, 'Hurry, be quick, do not stay.' And Jonathan's lad picked up the arrow, came to his master. But the lad was not aware of anything, only Jonathan and David knew about the matter." We'll stop there for a moment. David's fears are confirmed in these three short commands that Jonathan gives to his arrow chaser. Hurry, be quick, do not stay. Of course, those commands, although given to Jonathan's servant, they were unmistakably intended for David. And later, with the boy gone, they share a tearful farewell. Let's continue reading verse 40. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to his lad and said to him, "Go, bring them to the city." When the lad was gone, David rose from the south side and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times, and they kissed each other and wept together. But David wept the more. Jonathan said to David, "Go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of Yahweh, saying, Yahweh will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever." Then he arose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. David shows his respect to Jonathan by bowing 3 times before him. And, of course, they both show their love for one another by this intense weeping that's going on. Their tearful kisses to one another not only depict their deep affection, but also the uncertainty of what lay ahead. It tells us that David wept the more. And no wonder. I mean, who knows what lay ahead for David? He didn't know. He was unsure of what the future held. He was the anointed king, but Saul was already showing how determined he was in his relentless drive to kill David. Plus, what about his wife and his friend Jonathan here? Would he ever see them again? Now, this wouldn't be the last time that David and Jonathan see each other. We see them again later on in chapter 23, but they couldn't have known that at this point. We see David weeping throughout his life, and it's recorded that he weeps at least 5 times. Here, for us, we read, but also in 1 Samuel chapter 30, when his wife and children are taken by the Amalekites, and 2 Samuel chapter 1, when he finds out that Saul and Jonathan are dead, in 2 Samuel 12, when he finds out that the son that he had fathered with Bathsheba had died, or at least was sick. He wept because the child was sick. And in 2 Samuel 18 and verse 33, when he finds out his own son Absalom dies. David is obviously very tender-hearted, and he weeps when the circumstances call for it. And maybe this is part of what makes him a man after God's heart, his willingness to mourn whenever injustice is done, or whenever the sad occurrences of sin come to fruitfulness. Well, back here we find in 1 Samuel chapter 20 that they finally leave. And it's interesting to me that as David departs, Jonathan goes back to the city. That's what we find in verse 42. And back to his father's service. Now, Jonathan's loyalty to his father is shown in his return to Saul. After all, he still is his father's son. There's still battles to be fought against the Philistines and the enemies of the Israelites. And in spite of his devotion and his covenant to David, and in spite of Saul's desire to kill his friend, his covenant brother, he returns to support his father in the ongoing work of the kingdom. And although David and Jonathan would be physically separated, they would be inseparably joined by the oath, the vow, the covenant that they had sworn to one another in God's name. And that's the last thing that they say to one another before they leave. Jonathan said to David in verse 42, "Go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever." This passage is one of the most poignant and heart-wrenching in David's life. And his life is going to be marked by difficulty and heartache, some of it brought on by his own actions. But there's no doubt that his friendship with Jonathan was a uniquely special one to him. And for the next several years, we'll see that David is going to be a man on the run as Saul continues his campaign to do him in. But those years of being a refugee, those years of being a fugitive, are going to help prepare him to rule God's people. And they're going to help forge his character, and most especially his reliance, his trust, and his dependence on God. Well, thanks for joining us as we look through this chapter concerning these 2 covenant brothers, David and Jonathan. I hope you'll be with us next time. Thanks. God bless you.